little bit of my background. So I worked for the Sexual Health Leadership Institute, looking at health disparities for children in particular, with some parenting interventions held there, work supported by the National Institute for Minority Health and Health Disparities. So a lot of my work has kind of, my training is kind of in developmental psychology with human development and family studies. I'm also a trained therapist, marriage and family therapist as well. And so that's kind of my background, but my research interests primarily are focused on, fatherhood in African-American community, looking at intergenerational fathering practices and how, fathers' experiences with their own fathers impacts their mental health and their intimate relationship quality and how they engage with their children. And so I'm just gonna kind of give you a broad overview of the fatherhood field in general. And so just to give you a broad overview, so fatherhood research in general is a relatively new field when we're thinking about it in the social sciences. Interest in it didn't really come to the forefront until maybe about the 1950s, 1940s, after the Second World War, because they're really interested in understanding, fathers are away at the war. And so what did that impact have on child development and child well-being, okay? And interestingly, so when we're thinking about, so Paul Amato, really big in this space, he talks about how this is a highly negotiated concept, fatherhood. When you think about motherhood, you automatically think of some of the characteristics, and those things have kind of remained relatively the same across the generations or for time. But even if we look at fatherhood from the 1950s to right now, what we would consider would constitute, I guess, good fathering would be very different, right? Very, very different. And so this is a very highly negotiated field that is ever changing. So I just kind of want to give that as a backdrop. All right. And then so let me just go ahead and share my screen here. All righty. For me, also in thinking about fatherhood in general, just context really matters, all right? When we're thinking about the overall well-being, and I think, even as a counselor, when people come in with their presenting issues, it's kind of what is going on in their immediate environment that could be impacting their individual well-being. And so when we look at fatherhood and father involvement as a concept, so Michael Lee Lamb came up with, ideas of what is a part of fatherhood and father involvement. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But I just want to set as the context that, or for our conversation today, the importance of the environmental milieu in which fathers are embedded. Okay. And so because when we're looking at fatherhood in comparison to, mothering practices and motherhood, it appears from the research that fathering may be more amenable to those contextual factors, meaning how things are going on in the intimate relationship quality that can impact access even to their children, which is a component of father engagement. When we're thinking about, if there's a co-parenting situation, we call it maternal gatekeeping. You probably heard of that term before. And so there's this whole idea of the fathering vulnerability hypothesis that was coined, maybe about 20 years ago by Gokin, Murray, and Cummins. And it just really talks about how the influence of the intimate relationship quality with that biological mother may potentially impact father engagement a little bit more than the engagement of that mother. And so that's why they talk about it with respect to this vulnerability hypothesis, which has been tested. But I want to go all the way back to kind of the basics when we're thinking about the impact of context on how parents show up, essentially. I'm a big attachment person. I'm not going to go too deeply into attachment theory that was coined by Dr. John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth. But when we're thinking about how we show up in parenting, a lot has to do with our developmental history. okay, how we were parented, maybe even trauma or trauma that has not been experienced. And so when people come into parenthood, there are so many different factors, and that's that intergenerational element here with that developmental history. And that's so important, especially even when we're thinking about potential ACEs. And you guys are probably very familiar with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. Research conducted by CDC in partnership with Kaiser Permanente, looking at how trauma in the past impacts people's health trajectories, essentially, right? And so that is so important to consider. And then not only that, but there's this huge soup of things that impacts how fathers show up. Their personality as an individual, what's going on in the work, in their work environment. And then, here they have marital relations, but that relationship with that other parent, right? All of that is impacting how they show up as a parent. And not only that, but there's also, every child is different. Such that, with one child, it's totally different, when you have more than one child, and if you do, or if you don't, or if you as teachers, how each student can be so different, and that can impact even how you show up in your teaching, such that, so you have all of those factors to consider, even the support, as we always talk about, it takes a village to raise, a healthy child, and things of that nature. So all of these things are kind of interacting and impacting how people show up, how fathers show up. And it definitely has child development implications. But there's really kind of sometimes these bi-directional relationships, and it's just really all of these things co-occurring that are impacting how those fathers really show up. And so, I think that's why, if we're thinking about fatherhood, we have to look at that intergenerational transmission piece, right? We have to look at that developmental history. Because where do you guys think most people learn how to parent? Would you
From their
say?
parents.
From their parents, and unless they take a class, unless they are, getting trained, or unless they're very proactive, oftentimes the models that were presented to them are oftentimes the ones that they repeat. And so those factors are very, very important. I think even in our community in particular, it's really important to look at early paternity as well, because developmentally, you're still kind of growing up, but you're also parenting a young child. And what does that mean for their identity as fathers? Having a strong sense of an identity in that role actually bodes well for how people show up in the fathering role. So when we're thinking about the conceptualization of fatherhood, or father involvement in particular, so Michael E. Lamb, who I was talking about earlier, and his colleagues, these are the three kind of components that we're looking at when we talk about father involvement. So this is kind of just the basics, overall umbrella stuff, right? Accessibility. How accessible is he to his children? How engaged is he with his children directly, with some of those caregiving behaviors, caretaking behaviors, and things of that nature. And one thing that is very encouraging about African-American fathers in particular is, with those caregiving activities, especially when they're little, bathing and feeding and things of that nature, we do see that African-American fathers are more highly engaged in some of those activities than their counterparts, so that's definitely very, very encouraging there. And then this degree of responsibility. So these are kind of the subconstructs underneath this entire construct of father involvement. And so, a lot of times they'll be looking at, the studies will be looking at various things specific to those, all right? And interestingly, so why is fatherhood important? Because what we see in the research is that there's something qualitatively different with respect to the impact of a father's engagement with their child than a mother's engagement. So there's something unique about what fathers bring And there's something unique about what mothers bring. And they're both of value, right? Very much so, both of value. And father involvement in particular has been shown to lower the incidence of internalizing and externalizing behaviors in children, improve academic success, especially when dads are reading to their kiddos. Oh my goodness, the impact that has on literacy is just phenomenal. A lower incidence of risk-taking behavior. And then even some of the differences with respect to how they engage, with their children based on gender and things of that nature. So what we're seeing is that they add something qualitatively unique that is important for child development. So it's just an overall piece there. I love to look at, mental health for fathers in particular. And one thing that I think is really, because that's such a huge piece, how you're functioning with your own mental health can definitely impact, how you're functioning as a parent. And I think what's really important to consider with respect to the impact of gender, potentially some of, if we, well, some things that we're seeing for men who identify as male, and the difference, and then the depressive symptomatology that we see is that a lot of times depression doesn't look like depression. Okay. And when I say that, how do you think depression may show up differently for men or fathers when compared to women and mothers? Like when you hear that the depressive symptomatology of men may be a little bit different, what do you, I'm already talking to the choir. I'm already talking to my mental health providers here. So come on now, tell me what you're thinking when you hear that.
My first thought that comes to mind is anger and irritability.
Yeah, that's
and
right.
Comparison to like the hopelessness and the sad and the anhedonia that you typically see in depressive or folks who experience depression.
Yes, Aaron, you're so spot on. That's exactly right. It's exactly it. And a lot of times, with the anger and irritability, what is that usually met with? That's usually met with a wall. That's not usually met with compassion. That's not usually met with empathy, like the sadness would be. And so sometimes we may see that, oh, there's anger and irritability. And so people may not always understand how to handle that or what the really root to it is. And so there are some new measures that are starting to assess depression differently for men so that we can actually tap into, that unique depressive symptomatology there. So thank you so much for sharing, and you're definitely spot on there. But I think it's so critical because there's this whole idea of the spillover effect. Such that, stress in one area is going to spill over, into another area. That's why context really matters. And I think that's what's beautiful about our approach here at the center is that, we're taking that community-based approach. We're trying to consider all of these other factors. And a lot of you all talk a lot about, racial inequities, and a lot of your work is focusing in on that. That is so critical to understand as well, as all of these experiences are also in that contextual soup as well. So, oh my goodness, that adds a whole nother level as well. So thank you so much for your expertise and the work that you're doing, because it is extremely relevant. It is extremely relevant. And so when we're looking at parental depression and how it impacts parenting in particular, we see typically maybe some more harsher parenting strategies, decreased interactions, less displays of positive affect, and so that can be extremely problematic when we're thinking about it in the context of parenting. So those are just a few of the things that I kind of wanted to talk about as well. But specifically as it relates to father involvement. But here's the thing: oftentimes people don't become fathers isolated from a relationship with the other parent. So some kind of way they're going to have to navigate that, whether that's through co-parenting, whether that's through a marriage, whether that's through, cohabiting relationship or what have you. There's usually someone else involved to some type of degree, or or maybe not. Oftentimes there's so many different constellations for family structures out there. But a lot of times, like I said before, and then with those extended family networks as well, something very important to understand when we're thinking about Black fathers. But when we're thinking about the intimate relationship in particular, if there is a lot of conflict there, then that definitely can spill over into access, how he is showing up, or how the mother, is showing up, or how the other partner is showing up, the grandparent, whomever. So it's something that is very important to consider as well. There's so much reason. I could probably just do a presentation just on this, just also too, Dr. Mona L. Sheikh, who is at Auburn University, she looks at marital conflict or relationship conflict between the parents. And she's a sleep expert. And what she's finding from her research is that children who are living in a context where there is high conflict between the parents, they're not sleeping as well. So that level of hypervigilance negatively impacts their sleep. And what they have found is that some of the symptoms of it actually mirror ADHD. And for these children, when they're doing, those standardized testing, but looking at their IQ scores in particular, for those children who come from homes that are have higher degrees of conflict, we are seeing lower IQ scores for it. So when I say context matters for child well-being and functioning, it really does.